It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our signature event, Dialogue Across Difference, Communication Challenges in a Post-Truth Era. We live in an era where polarization along belief and values axes and pressure to take sides can harden stances and lead to adversarial communication practices. Toxic tropes and the absence of dialogue altogether are on the rise, weakening our democratic institutions and threatening democracy itself. How we wrestle with these dilemmas, consult research and theory, and apply knowledge to practice requires a multidisciplinary scholar-practitioner approach. Tonight, the School of Professional Studies is very pleased to explore the manifestations of conflict talk through the scholar-practitioner lens of 3 SPS communication-based disciplines: strategic communication, narrative medicine, and negotiation and conflict resolution. Panelists will share research and practices intended to foster connection, facilitate communication, and strengthen democratic practices. I would now like to introduce the moderator of tonight's panel, Dr. Christine Billmeyer. Dr. Billmeyer is a professor of professional practice in strategic communication, Dean Emerita of the Faculty of Professional Studies, and Program Director of the Strategic Communication Masters of Science program at SPS. She served as Dean and Professor of SPS from 2009 to 2015. Prior to her work at Columbia, Dr. Billmeyer served as the Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences and Executive Director of the College of Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Billmeyer is a recognized scholar, educator, and consultant in gender equity, diversity, and global communication in the workplace. Her work lies at the intersection of linguistics, sociology, anthropology, and gender studies. At SPS, she teaches gender communication in the workplace and global communication for professionals. An advocate for the advancement of women globally, she writes on that topic and speaks frequently at national and international meetings. Dr. Billmeyer is currently working on a longitudinal project on women's empowerment in Japan. Also known for her work in organizational leadership and transformation, Dr. Billmeyer consults with clients who wish to meet the demands of rapidly changing, complex environments, build equity into their structure and communication, and design resilient, forward-thinking working places. She works with multinational companies, governmental and non-governmental organizations, and institutions of higher education in the US, Europe, Middle East, South America, and Asia. Dr. Billmeyer earned her PhD in applied linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania and her bachelor's degree at Vassar College. She is fluent in Italian and speaks Spanish and French, and she has lived in England, France, and Italy. Once again, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Christine Billmeyer.
Thank you, Eric, and everyone, and let me welcome all of you once again to this event. It's such a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and also with each of our panelists. But before I introduce them, I would like to say a few words about the structure of tonight's event. We will begin with a panel, and each panelist will share a framework that their discipline uses to approach difficult conversations. Then each will give an example of how they have used their framework in real life at 3 different societal levels: at the grassroots level of a statewide political campaign, at an organizational level, and at an interpersonal level. After the panel, we welcome your questions. You have index cards and pens at each table, and we are using this method of Q&A because research has shown that more diverse voices are heard in these sessions when audience members have an opportunity to gather their thoughts and frame their questions and write them down. And I'll remind you at different times during the panel that we're doing this. But that's not all. The reason you are seated at round tables tonight is to extend the conversation among all of you and engage you in considering how these practices and principles can apply to your own experiences and shed light on future encounters. And by doing so in true SBS fashion, we will be putting scholarship into practice. And finally, don't go away, because we will end the evening with a reception, including past hors d'oeuvres. So now, with great pleasure, let me introduce our panel. To my left is Ashley All, a 2023 graduate of the SPS Master's Degree Program in Strategic Communication at Columbia. She is a political strategist with over 20 years of experience working in some of the most challenging political environments in the country. In 2022, Ashley served as the communication director and spokesperson for the Kansas coalition that secured a historic landslide victory in the first vote on reproductive rights following the fall of Roe v. Wade. Since then, she has worked on similar campaigns in Kentucky, Montana, Michigan, and Ohio that succeeded. Ashley is a national leader in values-based messaging. Her work in Kansas helped inform and update the way advocates communicate about abortion in post-Roe America. Ashley founded and is president of a nonprofit organization called the Kansas Coalition for Common Sense, I love the alliteration, to strengthen advocacy in her home state. She also serves as senior advisor to Families United for Freedom. Ashley received her bachelor's degree from the University of Kansas, and she lives in Lawrence, Kansas with her husband and her 5 children. To Ashley's left is Clarence Coxum. He is the Executive Director of Finance and Administration at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. In his current role, Clarence manages all financial, administrative, and human resource operations for the Society of Fellows at Heyman, the Society of Senior Scholars, and the Friends of the Heyman Center. Clarence teaches at SPS in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Master's Program. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in negotiation and conflict resolution from Columbia, as well as a master's degree in conflict resolution studies from Nova Southeastern University. Clarence resides with his family in New York City, and he is also a certified mediator to help empower his local community by cultivating an understanding of peace through the use of conflict resolution skills. Dr. Danielle Spencer is a faculty member in the Columbia University Narrative Medicine program, where she teaches courses on narrative medicine, philosophy, and narrative ethics, among others. Danielle lectures widely on narrative medicine, supporting community and health professions initiatives, and giving invited talks at academic conferences internationally. Danielle is also the author of Metagnosis, if that's the way it's pronounced. It is in Italian, anyway. Revelatory Narratives of Health and Identity, and co-author of the Perkins Prize-winning The Principles and Practice of Narrative Medicine. Her scholarly and creative work appears in diverse outlets from the Lancet to Plowshares. Among her current book projects is an exploration of dialogue in contemporary healthcare, including what structural forces limit or nourish it. Formerly, artist-musician David Byrne's art director, Danielle holds a BA from Yale University, an MS in narrative medicine from Columbia University, and a PhD from Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz. She has been awarded fellowships at McDowell and Yaddo. And not sitting on the panel, but facilitating the interactive session is Dr. Beth Fisher Yoshida. Beth is a professor of professional practice and director of the Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program at SPS. She is also the co-chair of the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity in the Climate School and director of the Youth, Peace, and Society Project at the Earth Institute Climate School, all at Columbia University. Beth is a prolific writer, publishing articles, books, book chapters, and edited volumes. Her newest books include New Story, New Power, A Woman's Guide to Negotiation, published in 2023, and Peace Building in Colombia, From the Lens of Community and Policy, co-written with Joan C. Lopez. Her research areas are women and negotiation, organizational conflict, and youth leadership. President and CEO of Fisher Yoshida International, a consulting firm, Beth partners with clients to strengthen their core negotiation and communication skills and resolve conflicts. Her clients have included global organizations across industries in the private sector, as well as nonprofit and government sectors, academic institutions, schools, and communities. Dr. Fisher Yoshida received her PhD and MA from Fielding Graduate University in Santa Barbara, California, and an MA with honors from Columbia University. She received both a BA and BS from Buffalo State College. Beth is a certified clinical sociologist, and she speaks conversational Japanese and lived and worked in Japan for 13 years. So, to start, I would like to begin by asking each panelist to briefly introduce a framework or approach that your discipline draws upon to encourage dialogue across difference. And Ashley, would you begin?
Thank you. Good evening. I am thrilled to be here with you tonight to discuss the very real challenges of communicating in a polarized time. When I began this strategic communications program in 2021, I was also about to begin one of the most challenging projects of my professional career. And that's saying something because I have worked for 20 years to elect Democrats in the conservative state of Kansas. And so I am used to tough work. As I began my studies here, I quickly realized that the framework that we used, that we were following in our coursework, was identical to that of the campaign that was unfolding in my home state. And quite frankly, it was identical to the campaign structure that I'd worked with on all of the campaigns in my professional career. Regardless of whether we're dealing with corporate, cultural, political, organizational, or even interpersonal communications challenges, the strategic communications framework can provide structure and guidance in solving some of the most challenging and divisive issues of today. And quite frankly, it was a security blanket for me during uncharted territory of 2022 after the fall of Roe. My priority as a strategic communications practitioner in public policy and advocacy is to take incredibly complex issues, discover common ground and shared values among voters, and bring diverse audiences together to make change. To accomplish this, there needs to be almost constant feedback and interaction between the strategy, target audiences, and stakeholders. This means feedback between diverse coalition partners who are working together, or feedback between research and about the voters and checking to see whether our messages are effective, or providing additional research to the media as the campaign unfolds. The framework we use to build a communication strategy and engage citizens on divisive issues like abortion or gun safety provides necessary structure to work that can be complex, overwhelming, and often emotionally charged. One key skill in our approach, and probably all of the approaches, is listening. Listening even when it makes you uncomfortable, listening even when you disagree, and gathering the information you need to keep the conversation going, to solve the challenge, course correct if necessary, and achieve the stated objective. The strategic communications framework we use is pretty straightforward. First, you set an objective. We often set SMART objectives, which encourage us to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Obviously, in a political campaign, it is very smart, and there is definitely an end date. After we determine a clear objective, the second step is to conduct significant research, extensive research. We look at background, history, issues, opinions, audiences, values. That can include in-depth interviews, focus groups, online journaling, surveys, creative ad tests, and much more. We listen to the target audiences and stakeholders throughout the entire process. Next, we evaluate our research. We determine insights. We take volumes of information and data to distill and find clear insights. And these insights help us better define the target audience, identify critical secondary audiences, highlight themes or values, pinpoint biases, and much more. Next, we build the plan to meet our objective. We develop messaging and deploy a strategy for deploying those messages. That can be television ads or storytellers, peer-to-peer dialogue, or influencer content. The strategic communications framework helps us break down complex issues and make the communications process in these campaigns more manageable. Each campaign that I've worked on to defend reproductive rights includes diverse coalitions of individuals and organizations who are passionate about their ideals. Many of them have different beliefs than the voters we're trying to persuade. The strategic communications framework can guide us through those difficult and complicated conversations, both within an organization and also within a political movement. It prioritizes research and listening to help us craft the best message, the most effective message, using the right language to persuade our target audience and meet our communications objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Clarence, would you like to share some grounding in the negotiation conflict resolution that you have used?
Indeed. Excuse me. We communicate and interact through many mediums. But how much do we listen? How much do we engage in meaningful dialogue based on what we hear, see, and feel? David Bohm, the renowned physicist and philosopher, viewed the practice of dialogue as a way of exploring the roots and crises facing humanity during the early 80s. Bohm thought that the practice of dialogue could provide inquiry and understanding of the processes that fragment and interfere with the real communication between individuals. I'm drawn to the practice of dialogue both for its complexity and simplicity. This is the first of many paradoxes I have encountered with the practice of dialogue. Some aspects of this practice are viewed as too abstract, which confuse participants. They need something concrete, while others view this as a process with no endpoint. It's not uncommon for participants to wonder if they are engaging in the process correctly. Bohm further contends that dialogue is a way of observing collectively how hidden values and intentions control our behavior and how unnoticed cultural differences can clash without our realizing that it's in fact happening. Bohm saw the use of dialogue as an exploratory process where there are no firm rules, though there are some guidelines, and the purpose is not to solve the problem or come to an agreement, rather take what the process gives us. There's one of those sort of paradoxes. There are no authority figures, and all participants are viewed as equals. There we go. There are five dimensions to the practice of dialogue. There's dialogue as a conversation, people coming together, talking, listening, and sharing. Dialogue is inquiry, where an underlying assumption, motivations, and beliefs shared when we talk. Creation of shared meaning, shared content of consciousness, multiple viewpoints, accepting the risk of being transformed. Then there's dialogue as a participatory process, engagement that is not hierarchical, participating from a place of openness, interconnectedness, self-aware, self-reflective. And then there's dialogue as a collective form of meditation, accepting of what's around me, people, behavior, situations, etc., without attempting to change it. The use of dialogue that Bohm described, which is vast, isn't applicable to all situations, however. If one were to apply this to an organizational issue, it would require modifications. Organizations, as we know, have leadership, which changes the landscape. In any organization, there are likely to be pre-existing relationships and hierarchies to consider. It's common for individuals to fear reprisal for expressing thoughts openly or being critical of the organization's practices. This poses a challenge for sure, thus the facilitator must work to address this. Failure to do so can impact the degree of transparency and openness essential to the dialogue process. Let's talk about some of the guidelines. Allow space for each person to talk. What is my investment in this process? Suspension of thought, suspension of judgment, suspension of impulses, active listening. The participants should position themselves to actively listen, that is, do not hear the message through your thought process and added reasoning, but hear the message as it is conveyed. Listen to the message without any preconceived notions. Effective dialogue can only happen if the parties listen to each other without prejudice and without trying to influence others that their position is the correct position. There are limitations to the practice of dialogue, of course, but this should be viewed as a tool we can use to address some communication challenges we continue to face. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarence. Danielle, would you like to pick up the thread and talk to us about narrative medicine principles?
Well, yes, thank you. It's wonderful to be here in dialogue with all of you. Narrative medicine. So in the words of physician and literary scholar Rita Sharon, narrative medicine is medicine practiced with the, quote, narrative skills of recognizing, absorbing, interpreting, and being moved by the stories of illness. One of its fundamental tenets is the importance of narrative competence, of attending to the form and structure of storytelling. A clinician taking a patient history, like the skilled reader of a literary work, must recognize and understand not simply the data as it fits into the checkboxes of the medical record, but also the way the individual relates their experience, including context, narrative voice, tone, figurative language, and temporality. Oh,
I know, we didn't. Ah,
Where
okay,
does-
there we are.
where does the account begin? What is left out? Which perspectives are represented and how? Once we begin with this premise, moreover, it becomes clear that for dialogue to occur, we must recognize that both teller and receiver construct meaning reciprocally. The individual seeking medical care, for example, must also be understood as a reader and interpreter, and we must create conditions for shared meaning to take form in the clinical setting and beyond. How do we accomplish this? In narrative medicine, one of the ways we strive toward this goal is by nurturing skills of close reading. We do this in classes where we study literature, philosophy, and creative writing, among other perspectives. We also conduct workshops where a small group practices close reading of a creative text. They may read a poem together, for example, discussing its use of figurative language, voice, and so forth. Participants may then respond to a brief writing prompt, sharing what they've written and practicing close reading in response to others' work. The format evokes curiosity and respect for different viewpoints, nurturing a sense of reciprocal trust. In the words of philosopher Friedrich Svenneus, quote, understanding is a necessary feature of the being together of human beings in the world. The workshop demonstrates the shared relational aspects of understanding and interpretation. Bringing this back to the clinical encounter, having nurtured these skills of close reading, the clinician or the person seeking care may offer a different form of attention. When there's a conflict or disagreement about, say, diagnosis or treatment, one may attend not simply to the point being contested, but pivot to consider the narrative context as well. The medical record, for example, can be understood as a particular narrative, one possible text among many. Other texts may include an individual's account of their own illness, including their feelings and values. How are these narratives presented? How might we recognize multiple valid stories and interpretations simultaneously? How might our stories and understanding evolve? The implications of this dialogical narrative approach extend well beyond the clinical encounter. For biomedicine is quite monologic. Medical discourse powerfully constrains what constitutes evidence, who is endowed with authority to write and interpret definitive texts. In contrast, narrative medicine invites us to consider a variety of texts and interpretations. Moreover, once we conceive of ourselves as readers, we are prompted to consider our ethical responsibilities as well. How might we remain mindful of our own particular perspective and how it informs our response and interpretation? How might we all, those seeking care as well as clinicians, cultivate humility and openness, both of which are preconditions for dialogue? In addition to its specific clinical applications, narrative medicine as a field of scholarly and creative inquiry explores these possibilities for nurturing dialogue in many ways. For example, in my own work, I research diagnosis, particularly the retrospective diagnosis of a long-standing undetected condition, as when, for example, an adult realizes that they are on the autism spectrum. I call this experience metanosis, with the prefix meta indicating change, as these experiences can prompt us to change our understanding of what constitutes disease, impairment, ability or disability, normalcy, etc. In the case of an autism diagnosis, for example, the biomedical narrative may be accompanied by neurodiverse perspectives, empowering us to find meaning in the rich varieties of human experience. One meaning of the prefix dia, or dia, is through, so diagnosis is literally through knowledge, just as dialogue is through the word, to quote David Bohm. In my work, I seek to recuperate the dialogical capacities of diagnosis, not to deny the narrative of a strictly biomedical diagnosis, but to see it in dynamic relation with the many different narratives of our lived experience. As we live in an age of exponential change in our scientific knowledge, nourishing such capacities for dialogue will prove ever more crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Now, before we move to the examples that each of our panelists will share, I'd like to remind you about the note cards for you to write your questions, and we'll collect them in about 10 minutes. Beth Fisher-Yoshida will collect them in about 10 minutes. So as you're thinking, as you're inspired to jot down something, please do so as we move through the next half of the panel discussion. So, panelists, now I would like to ask each of you to discuss a situation in which you were able to apply your disciplinary approach or framework to a challenging, complex, communication-based situation. And Ashley, I will ask you to start again with your slide right there. Good.
Thank you. So I've been a communications strategist for 20 years in some of the most challenging political environments in the country. That means we have to navigate some pretty difficult and complex dynamics in order to win. The temptation in political communications today is simply often to rally the base and speak only to those folks who agree with you already. That's definitely easier, and it might work in some places sometimes. But the stark reality is that in most states, it's a losing battle, especially on issues, an issue as complex and polarizing as abortion. In the real world, and there are real world consequences for millions of Americans if we lose these state reproductive rights campaigns. It can put women and families in an unthinkable situation or worse. It can cost them their fundamental rights, their freedom, their ability to have children, and in some devastating cases, it can cost them their life. In most states, when advocating for reproductive rights, we must appeal to a broader shared value like privacy or personal freedom to expand the coalition of voters. I believe when we can appeal to shared values, we should. And here's the great news, it works, even on hot button issues like reproductive rights. In 2022, my home state of Kansas became the first state in the nation to vote on abortion rights after the fall of Roe versus Wade. It was a historic campaign for many, many reasons, from the stunning 18-point margin to the unique messaging to the diversity of our coalition. And I could spend hours talking about how smart the strategy was and develop, the communications plan that we developed and the ads that led to that win. But the public advertising campaign was only possible because of the strategic communications work that was done behind the scenes between staff and coalition partners. From the very beginning of our coalition, values were central. We made it clear in our founding documents that we aspired to assume best intentions, to center those most impacted by abortion bans, to apply anti-racist principles to our processes and to our interactions, and to unite around a shared goal of defeating this amendment. The communications objective that we set together was to win while still embracing our values. Listening to each other was paramount. We conducted research. As we conducted research, we made sure that all of the participants, coalition partners, could participate. They watched focus groups, they listened to the real voters, and that was critical in building a shared understanding of the electorate and a shared appreciation for the importance of language and words how important they are in persuasion. Our insights helped the coalition understand that voters did not see abortion as a political issue. In fact, and it was very important that we kept the campaign nonpartisan. It also helped us understand that despite the fact that the vast majority of voters supported access to abortion, some still had concerns and some still wanted restrictions. When we came together as a coalition to make difficult decisions, we spent a substantial amount of time in discussion. We listened to each other, and we gave coalition partners time to share their perspectives and work through their concerns and differences. That was not always easy. There were tense moments for sure, many difficult conversations, but that's why the framework, this strategic communications framework and the research component was so important. It was essential to building consensus within the coalition. Our coalition believes in reproductive freedom, but that meant many different things to each partner, organization, and each individual. We were able to work through those differences together, and at the end of the day, every organization remained at the table and more joined. Despite differences of opinion, we were able to achieve consensus, and collectively, our shared goal was to win, and that is exactly what we did. The Kansas Coalition understood that after 50 years of powerful misinformation from anti-abortion activists, our campaign was just the first step in a much longer and much larger project to educate Americans with divergent opinions on reproductive rights and persuade them to fully support reproductive rights and reproductive freedom. Thank you.
Clarence, tell us about the situation where you applied dialogue in conversation.
Sure. So let's look at an instance where the practice of dialogue was utilized. I consulted for a small organization, roughly 60 employees, including management, where an issue arose and I was asked to assist. I had some general information, but it was clear that there were several communication channels used by employees to share information about the incident, which had an impact on the day-to-day work. An employee at Company Z was displeased with an incident that occurred at work, which prompted the individual to anonymously post details of the incident on social media. This in itself isn't all that problematic, as people use social media to vent, except that millions of readers have the ability to potentially weigh in on a given post and share with their respective networks, which adds the potential for greater reach, in essence going viral. In this case, the fallout was swift, as the post garnered more than 7 million views in the first 72 hours. With some detective work by a good citizen, the identity of the original poster was identified, as was the organization. This, in turn, began a domino effect, which impacted the employee that posted the information, the colleagues of said employee, and the organization. With feelings of betrayal and disappointment permeating the group, they had to figure out how to move forward. Some colleagues showed support, while others struggled to understand why the individual turned to social media with this issue. What was the end goal? My question to the client was, "You retain my services, how do you think I can help?" The client's response was, "I want to know why the employee did not come to me and what they thought they would accomplish. This can ruin our reputation." Now, in the NECR program, students learn about facilitation, mediation, and negotiation. The key to using these frameworks effectively is knowing when to employ the frameworks based on the information and circumstances at hand. So where do I go from here? With the information that I had, I thought that facilitating a dialogue would be a good starting point for the group, which would allow a forum for those affected by the actions directly and indirectly to speak to its impact. Although tensions were high, it seemed appropriate to begin the process to allow the emotions to be shared while they were still fresh. The practice of dialogue is meant to be an in-depth process, which can be complex and confusing, but I believe it has value and utility, which is why I chose to use it here. The structure was such as the management sent out an email to all employees to inform them that an outside consultant was retained to work with the group about the recent incident. All employees received an email with a Zoom link for the initial session. Employees were told that engagement was optional, not mandatory. Management would not be present for any of the sessions. Using dialogue in an organizational setting, modifications are necessary from what Boehm originally envisioned for the practice. The first of which is time. Ideally, participants would engage in dialogue over several sessions, but I allocated 4 because there's a cost associated with this and time is money. There were no plans to have the participants come to an agreement about what transpired. The idea was to give them a space to talk about it openly. The second modification was that the participants would be given a prompt and they could choose to share or not. I would provide all participants with an explanation of the dialogue practice and how I intended to employ it in our sessions. The first session, as I said, took place over Zoom over the course of 30 minutes. All participants were required to have their cameras on. 20 people attended. The first session was used to provide background on the dialogue practice and my rationale for using it to facilitate conversation. I provided guidelines which were intended to guide the process. Allow space for each person to talk, your investment in the process, suspension of thought, suspension of judgment, suspension of impulse. All participants were again informed that their engagement was optional. There was a fair degree of confusion, which I anticipated. The second session took place in person over the course of 90 minutes. 16 people attended. The session began with a recap of the previous session. I invited participants to ask questions to get clarity on the practice. I again provided the guidelines, which were also posted on an easel. I was asked by management to read the organization's mission statement. When I finished reading the mission statement, I asked the following question, which served as the prompt. Why are we here? And invited the participants to share. Roughly half the participants spoke, though not the individual that made the post on social media. Session 3 is tentatively scheduled for this Friday. Thank you.
So you're right in the midst of this. Darn. We won't have the outcome.
There shouldn't be an outcome.
Danielle, please let us hear from you now.
In healthcare, conflict can occur in many ways. A person in the role of physician and a person with an illness, for example, may have different understandings of the nature of the problem and how best to address it. Our narrative medicine approach draws attention to the various ways stories can be related and heard. For example, here's a story of clinical conflict. Mr. Jupiter visits his primary care physician, Dr. Pluto, and states that he's experiencing headaches. Dr. Pluto conducts a physical exam and asks Mr. Jupiter a series of questions about his symptoms. She asks him if he's been experiencing unusual stress. When he replies that he was recently laid off from his job as an audio engineer, she continues to ask about his home life and whether there are other factors that may exacerbate stress. Mr. Jupiter becomes annoyed. What do you think, I'm crazy? You're not a shrink. What about my migraines? Can't you just give me something to fix this? He asks. So here, Mr. Jupiter is seeking care, Dr. Pluto is seeking to offer care, yet both may feel quite frustrated. So how can the principles and practices of narrative medicine be helpful here? So first of all, the clinician trained in narrative skills can, quote unquote, read the situation in different ways. For example, a standard clinic note might begin something like this. Mr. J is a 52-year-old Caucasian male patient complaining of pounding headaches over temple areas. He reports no warning signs before headache. Headaches last several hours and light bothers his eyes. Headaches happen 1 to 2 times per week, not relieved by ibuprofen. Patient mentioned that he's experiencing financial stress due to recent employment termination. In this version of the story, there's no I doing the observing here. The physician is removed entirely. The information deemed medically relevant is presented economically. It follows a closely scripted pattern. Here's another version of the story written by Dr. Pluto. Mr. J is an independent person. In the past, he said that he's been working since he was 17, and he takes great pride in his profession. He's mentioned musicians he's worked with and how he's had to learn new software to keep up with the field. When I came into the room today, he was slouched on the exam table. He appeared annoyed. It seemed like something more existential was going on. As I started taking his history, he explained that he was recently laid off, and I felt my heart rate rise. I can write him for Imitrex to treat the migraines, sure, but can I do anything to help the underlying cause? Also, I missed lunch and I'm starving. Here, the narrator makes their own presence known as a character in the story. They include their own observations, intuitions, feelings, and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Mr. Jupiter might offer this narrative. I waited over an hour. My appointment was at 3, but I didn't see the doctor until after 4. She didn't seem interested in my headaches, but started asking about my family situation, exercise, whatever. I remembered that last year when my partner came in for knee pain, Dr. Pluto was really helpful. So why am I getting the runaround? She looks stressed out. Doesn't she want to be here? Can't she fix me? This version adds a key perspective and additional information. In contrast to the clinic note, it begins before the encounter with the wait. It includes a memory of other experiences with this physician and observations of the doctor herself. It offers some explanation as to why Mr. Jupiter might be feeling uncared for in this moment. So imagine if Mr. Jupiter and Dr. Pluto were to write these reflections and share them with one another. Or perhaps if each took a minute to imagine switching roles and writing a version of the story from another perspective. Even if there's not time to do this in a particular encounter, realistically, having participated in a past narrative medicine workshop may open each of them to consider different narratives, rather than remaining locked in opposition, each holding on to their own version of the story. Or, remaining in the moment, perhaps if either of them were to say simply, "Can you tell me a bit more about what's on your mind so I can understand better?" This is a way of offering close listening and close reading with an assumption that there are different stories to be told and heard, which is a precondition for dialogue, for creating a new story together. We all want to be heard, but we need to trust that if we share our stories, we will be heard. And to hear one another, we have to have skills of narrative understanding. These are just a few ideas and approaches. Honing the skills of narrative understanding can only benefit us in remaining open to the many varied, evolving narratives of our experience in healthcare and beyond.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you all, and please let's give everyone a round of applause for 3 very powerful stories that show how the scholarship in each one of our disciplines has value, not just in knowledge creation, gathering data and so on, but actually in improving situations in our lives at the personal level, and one of probably the most important encounters that we have in the healthcare system, within an organization, taking both the individual pain that obviously people are feeling and trying to find some means of talking about it, sharing emotions, and finding some resolution, to finding a means of putting together a coalition of people who don't necessarily ever even talk to each other or maybe even have opposing positions come together to create a very, very powerful movement. So I would love to just spend a few minutes asking you some questions, some follow-up questions, and then now is the time really for, if you are thinking along these lines, jotting down your questions. Beth is circulating now, and if you have a question between now and when I finish this kind of the moderated questions, then we will turn to your questions as well. So let me begin. So Ashley, you actually we should probably go back to one of your slides that I didn't have up, but after your listening campaign and all the data that you collected and the analyses, you were able to craft a message or messages that all members of the coalition could agree upon and stand behind. can you share with us your campaign slogans or the commonly agreed upon message that I think you may have? Is this the slide that
Yes.
you had?
Yes, this
I
is the
managed
slide.
to skip.
So we went through, in strategic communications and probably other disciplines as well, we go through a pretty significant research project to figure out both where people's public opinion is on certain issues, and also, who in the electorate, those different segments that might be willing to move. We divide those in different ways. Often it is like your base voters, just this is very simplified, but base voters, swing voters, and opposition voters. And when we're looking at messaging, we really want to understand where our base is, because we need them to do certain things like volunteer and show up to vote. But we also need to know very much where the swing voters, people who are persuadable, where they are. And so we did a significant amount of research, and fortunately for us, the most powerful message across the board, regardless of segment of the electorate, really dealt with people being able to make their own decisions, their own medical decisions, free from government interference. Talking about people and families being able to make these decisions privately, and also, just making sure that people could have those rights. They had the right to make the decisions for themselves. That was focusing on government interference, the right to make your private decisions, and keeping it, in your family. And that obviously passing this amendment would open the door to a total ban in our state. Those were the things that really united all of the different voting segments. And we tested a lot of different messages, and some of the messages were much more aligned with some of the more progressive organizations, what they wanted to say, and some of them, some of the messages just really fell flat. But when you're doing this research, you have to remember that you're listening to the voter. And I'm not looking for the message that resonates with me as an advocate, or the messenger that resonates with me as an advocate. I'm looking for the messages that are most effective with the voters we need to persuade, and the messengers that are most persuasive and trusted by the swing voters that we're trying to persuade.
And you may not be able to name the members of the coalition, but can you at least give us an example? Just talk about the spread along the political spectrum that you were, that you included in your discussions.
Yeah, we had quite a diverse coalition. Some of the core organizations were some of the core organizations that you might imagine. Planned Parenthood Great Plains was our local affiliate. We have another provider called Trust Women, and then there is another organization called United for Reproductive and Gender Equity, and then we also had a lot of really Kansas organizations. Kansas Values Institute was one, but then we had organizations that focused on moderate Republicans. Mainstream Coalition was one of them, and then we had, on the other end of the spectrum, we had a coalition member called the New Frontier Project that focused on young progressive Latino voters in Southwest Kansas. So it was a really broad spectrum, and it was, at times challenging, but also it encouraged us to do more to listen and understand where everyone was coming from and build consensus around the research and around the messages that we chose. And
the fact that everyone stayed engaged and in the conversation right to the end is also pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was. I'm not going to say that there weren't very tense conversations and difficult discussions, but they did stay. And I would also note that all of our decisions were unanimous. We really worked hard to get to that place, to work through all of the differences of opinion and make sure everybody felt heard in the conversation. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of patience, but it was really central to our organization and our values.
And that is something that really resonates with a lot of the research in political communication that shows, and political voice, that shows unanimous voting actually benefits everyone, because in order to get unanimity on a vote as opposed to majority rules, everyone has to talk. And the people have to be both understanding and persuasive, because if it's unanimous and one person votes no, then you can't succeed, you can't move forward. So the evidence is also in the result of the election, and that makes me think to move to Clarence and ask, how do you or the participants or whoever the leader or the non-leader is evaluate the effectiveness of this process, of the practice of dialogue process? How does it actually, how do you know it works?
Interesting question. It's a difficult process, right? Unfortunately, I don't have a metric where I can say it worked because we've moved to this part. We moved, 3 steps down the road. It may I gave you numbers. In the first session we had 20 people, in the second we had 16. Does that mean that what was conveyed in the first session wasn't effective, so 4 people dropped off? No, maybe it wasn't for them. But the way I tend to evaluate it, I do send surveys at the end, but I like to ask people what they get from the process, right? And that's how I can determine, and they can determine if they are getting what they need from it. It's this thing of returning to it. And so one of the things I mentioned is that Bohm talks about this happening over the course of years. We don't have that kind of time. So you have to put some constraints on it. And in this case, you had chatter that was happening. It could still be happening, because we'll find out later this week. But it's bringing these people into a space where you have been given sort of permission to speak freely, to speak openly, get these things out in the open, so that perhaps you can come to a greater understanding. So the one way I can look at this is that as someone who is impacted by this comment or this post, is that I'm supposed to sit back and suspend judgment when you did something that can, impact my livelihood. But if this person is showing up, that's showing me that there's progress.
Yes. Thank you. Danielle, I want to know specifically, how many physician practitioners have you already trained in narrative medicine? Because the world needs a lot of this understanding. Not specifically, but just generally.
12,362 and a half.
Great. I knew you knew that number.
Here at Columbia is where the field was founded. Morris Spiegel, sitting over there, was one of the founders, along with several other of our faculty. And it's an interdisciplinary field and practice. And there are a lot of different forms of training that the field, that we at Columbia are involved in, and then also now we're elsewhere. So we have the master's program here. Obviously, there's a certificate program, and narrative medicine has been part of the healthcare professions curriculum here at Columbia since before the master's program existed. And then the Division of Narrative Medicine Uptown also organizes these intense weekend workshops. Typically, the participants there are mid-career clinicians who perhaps they're feeling disaffected. They want something, they don't know exactly what it might be. They hear about narrative medicine, they're not sure what exactly it is necessarily. And then it's very inspiring, because they come and they're in a peer group of other like-minded folks, and hopefully the tools of the field and the thinking of the field offers them a helpful way to move forward. And it is growing internationally as well, so a lot of us try to support efforts to nurture narrative medicine both in healthcare professions curricula. That's sort of one of the founding places where it's implemented, but also with community groups and different ways that it's implemented.
Wow,
yeah.
That's great. That is wonderful. So now I have a handful of questions. Thank you very much for your participation. And this first question is to anyone on the panel. So how do you navigate hierarchies to hear grassroots voices? So it sounds like, Ashley, that's for you.
I think it's really important, especially in in campaigns, in this particular, in my area of expertise, which is campaigns, both political, like candidate campaigns and in issue campaigns. There are always going to be the main organizations, or the main, funders, or the main, supporters. And it is important that you listen to them, but it's also important that you go to the folks who are doing the work, who are out, knocking doors. And that was what was so fascinating about this particular campaign. We obviously had people at the table from our local Planned Parenthood, and we made sure that our kind of governing body was all Kansas organizations. Whether that it was a Planned Parenthood Great Plains organization, it was the local affiliate that was in charge. It was not the national organization that was in charge, because there's a different perspective when you go down to the local level. So we made sure that was important, and that we included them. But when I went out after the Dobbs decision, what we started hearing, especially after the Dobbs decision, after Roe was overturned, what we started hearing from so many people was kind of outrage among a different group of voters. Outrage and frustration and kind of disillusionment among more moderate Republican women, more independent and more conservative voters, people who probably hadn't even thought about this issue. But we reached out to them, they reached out to us. And you have to be intentional about it, because it doesn't easily happen. The folks who have privilege will definitely reach out to you and find you and make their voices heard. But often the people who don't, it's harder for them to get into the system and into the communications channels. And so we worked very hard to go out into communities and find people who were working with us and for us. And were passionate about this issue, to see how they felt and to help them communicate better. And it was one of the most inspiring things that I've been part of.
I also have to share one anecdote. I first met Ashley when she showed up in my gender in communication class in August of 2022. And before that class, because we have a lot of reading to do before, my course associate always keeps a close eye on who's on the Canvas website, who's doing the reading, and noticed Ashley hadn't been on it for too many minutes, and so sorry, Ashley. But then somebody said, "Oh, don't worry, she's in Kansas working on the vote," and I thought, "Oh, good for her. She took a bus from New York. She's out there knocking on doors, and good for her. She deserves a break." And it wasn't until the first day of class, when everyone did introductions, Ashley didn't say what she was really doing in Canvas, but one of the other students who knew then told the whole class. So, so it was a combination.
I would note it was a week after the election day.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It was immediately after. Okay, so Clarence, I think this one's for you. How do tense moments fueled by emotional overcharge meet with professionalism and a time-pressured dialogue? Any conscious guidelines for when one is put on the spot to facilitate mindful conversations when a dialogue is time-pressured?
So I think that in this particular situation, I had to put a number of sessions on it. Ideally, I wouldn't. I think that when you have buy-in into this kind of process, it yields results, right? That is, whether it's me getting something off of my chest, I think providing those guidelines, and as a facilitator, I like to provide the guidelines and step back, right? Because it's a process that should be owned by those that are participating in it. And so when you find that they are getting off the rails, you kind of go back to what those guidelines are and letting them know that, these are the things that are more likely to yield positive results. And that is, allowing someone, even if what you did impacted me adversely, maybe there's a rationale behind it that I can understand. There's some semblance of that. And I think the more that we can we can slow things down, like, it's taking these guidelines, I'd like to just put out leaflets and have them for everyone. But the fact of the matter is everyone's not ready for this kind of conversation. And I think the challenge is finding those people that say, I need more, right? And so I'm going to invest in this process. And I think one of the guidelines is what's your investment in the process. That's at the top. That should always be at the top, because if you're not fully invested in it, then it's not likely to yield very much.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Wow. And yes. Oh, yes. Sorry. Let's go away from there. Fade to black. Thank you. Danielle, this is a question for you. How much is the physical space, body positioning, etc., considered in patient-provider interactions in narrative medicine?
Well, that's such a wonderful question, and it also exposes something that that we don't talk about enough. I think it's an enormous part of it. One of the classes in our master's program, in the narrative medicine master's program, is called Bodies, Illness, and Care, and we do some exploration of the philosophical field of phenomenology with my colleague Craig Irvine, who's a philosopher. But you don't need to study philosophy to be aware of it and attentive to it. Here's an example. We have a project that we do in the program. It's a witnessing assignment, which is to go into a clinical space and witness. And sort of to the frustration of some students initially, we don't give a lot of guidelines as to what form this could take, because part of what happens is in the process of discovering what can be witnessed when you're in the room but not charged with writing the medical note or having any particular goal except to be a witness. What does it mean to be a witness? Anyway, the point is that in these witnessing accounts, often there are very detailed evocative descriptions of the body language of the persons in the room, the physical layout of the room. Where's the computer monitor? Is it between the clinician and the patient? Is who's looking where, the gaze, all these things. And I think our understanding of narrative, or at least for me, is quite expansive in the sense that stories don't have to be written down, but a story can also be told in the body. Our bodies do hold stories. And how can we remain open to being attentive to them and receptive to that language of the body? It's a great question. Thank you.
It is. It's a fabulous question. So, a question for Ashley. How are you adapting the lessons learned in Kansas to the other states? I mean, I imagine you find differences and so on. How has the roadmap changed?
That is a great question, and we're still learning. So in August of 22 was the first vote in Kansas, and in November of that year there were I think 5 more. Let me count. So California, Vermont, Montana, Michigan, and Kentucky, 5 more, and each state. Obviously California and Vermont, they already had great laws in the books, so they were in pretty good shape. The other states had really complicated electorates to deal with, and Michigan was the first affirmative ballot initiative. And states have very unique, whether it's history or values. In Montana, their constitution very much elevates privacy. In Michigan, it was a unique situation because it was an affirmative vote, and they had a governor running. There were lots of different things, and so we did take lessons on the messaging from Kansas, but you absolutely have to go again and do the research. And so we did the same process, maybe using lessons learned as the starting point in each of these places. But we needed to know, based on their electorate and the different segments, how each of those messages would work. In Michigan, they ended up going with something that was much more restore Roe. And in Kentucky, the message was very similar to Kansas, focusing on private medical decisions. In Ohio, the best message was really about putting families putting families back in charge of these private medical decisions. So it is taking lessons learned, but then building upon the research and the data that you have to make sure that you're connecting with the voters from each individual state.
Great. Panelists, is there anything you'd like to comment on in each of the other panelists' comments? Because I saw Danielle shaking her head when Clarence was mentioning something, and Clarence shaking his head when Ashley was mentioning. I'm shaking my head with everybody. So.
I mean, I would say that obviously, I think that we all use. I mean, we use aspects of dialogue and different things, and in the conversations that we have, and in a very different field in the practical sense. So I absolutely see overlap in all of them, and the importance of listening and being aware and observant of all of the things, the body language that was talked about with narrative medicine. So I think they overlap very well.
I'm really curious because when I think about politics and where we are today and where we were 10 years ago even, this thing of this shared meaning, right? And when you talk about, getting people together on a unanimous vote, like that to me is something that seems to be so far out, and I'm wondering, not in great detail, but like what that process is like and how long does that process take, right? When I think about something like dialogue, as Boehm talked about, and it can go on for years, when you don't have that kind of time, you have constraints because whether there's something going to happen within 6 months or 12 months, like how do you and your group pull that together?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's incredibly challenging. One of the things that we did in each of the cases, each of the campaigns that I worked on, we did the research, and then we kind of started with this messaging framework, this like essentially a grid of these are the messages that we know work with the voters that we need to persuade. Does everybody approve? And that was kind of preemptively approved before the campaign got hot and heated. And so that kind of helped the process along. We did all that before before the things were starting to get crazy. But as the campaign went along, there definitely were times where you felt an urgency. Political campaigns are probably some of the most intense timelines. I mean, we have to turn stuff around in 24 hours. We don't ever get off our email any time of day or night. But you have to slow down in a coalition in order to make sure that you have time to listen. And that can be, it can be incredibly difficult and at times frustrating. But we were intentional about putting that in our kind of values at the beginning, that we wanted to make sure that people had the ability to be heard and listened to and to voice their concern and to work through it as a group. And so, we would set aside time to do that. And sometimes our deadlines got pushed back. Sometimes we weren't able to ship a new ad the day that we were supposed to ship a new ad. And that was just something we dealt with because the consequences of not listening and not building consensus was something that we weren't willing to let happen. But we were willing to let, an ad be late. It's just accommodating that, but it was challenging.
One of the other things that I'm hearing is that there has to be strong agreement and buy-in to the process. Without that, it can't happen. And when you decided where to build your coalition and what groups to bring in, what about the people who are left out? And this goes to one of the questions about one of the biggest challenges in communication in a volatile society is historical revisionism. When people or institutions ask, have revised history to build their own case, and how can we best fight historic revisionism? Is it something that we just have to put over here and not try to fight against it and build coalitions from people who are willing, who are in the middle, who are willing to listen to both sides, who are willing to have a conversation? When someone is in that hardened stance position, what does one do? Do you try to engage, or do you say, I'm going to work with a different group? anybody. This is, I think it applies to people in organizations too, when given the opportunity. We don't know if the 4 who left
Right.
the meeting are just, I have my own opinion of this and no one's going to change my mind, or I had a baseball meeting, my son was at a baseball, game and I couldn't go.
But my inclination is to always engage, right? And, for me, with a process like this, explaining it can take several sessions, right, for people to understand it. And I made a comment like people wondering, am I doing this correctly? And maybe this is too complicated to engage in. But I think if you look at what, if your desire is to have something other than what you have, like you want an alternative, you present these options, right? And it might be that, from the 16 people that return, only 10 return later, and those 10 that return would continue to come back and get what they needed that would put them, better position them for future sort of interactions like this, right? And so that's kind of the way I think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you want to at least, present the options and let people decide whether or not it's something that they can, align themselves with and move forward or not. And both instances are okay.
Danielle?
Yeah, if I can just add, in speaking of the wonderful complementarities and similarities between these approaches, of course, the Bohm groups and the narrative medicine workshops have a lot in common. And but I think this speaks to your question as well, which is that both are a process. And so sometimes the buy-in question or the starting off with positions that seem so rigid that how are we ever going to possibly hear each other, there's people often want to know at the outset, well, what's the structure, what's the deliverables, what's going to happen, explain it all to me. But it's experiential, and it can be very powerful, and it's relational. And so sometimes people are resistant, and then they have a very powerful experience. Maybe they can articulate to some degree what happened, what might have shifted in their thinking. Maybe a lot of it is emotional or embodied. All these things, right? And of course we want to be able to describe and make a beautiful PowerPoint slide that describes everything that happened, but we can't, because that's not the nature of experience, right? Sometimes we just know that there's something important that happens when human beings are together in the world, and especially if they come together with a shared goal of trying to understand one another better. So there are various tools and rubrics and disciplinary approaches to doing this, but I think a lot of it is about that presence and then the unexpected of what can happen in those experiences.
And we have come to the end of our question and answer period, but there is one fabulous one that I think we could spend 30 seconds on, 10 seconds for each. This is a really great wrap-up. If we are in a post-truth era at this point, what type of era do you predict we will arrive at next? And it would be a positive era based on all of your beliefs and knowledge, beliefs, and practices. Oof.
The hard one. The hardest one. I would say optimistic era.
An era of optimism.
Looking at an environment like this, I would say, we have people who have chosen to come out and listen, right? And so clearly there was something about this panel that interested them. And if they could take something from this and pass that on, then I think I echo Ashley here, and that it gives me reason for optimism.
Right. Danielle?
Yeah, I would say there was never anything that was unmediated truth, because we always experience these truths in a particular context. So if in the current messy era we're becoming more attentive of what those mediating factors are, the end result is not going to be a cesspool of nihilistic relativism, but it's going to be one of peace, love, and prosperity.
All right, on that note, let's give our audience our panelists another round of applause.